When Fallon casually asked about love, Keanu Reeves and Alexandra shared a deeply honest, unexpected answer that left the entire studio silent for a moment. Their raw emotions, shy smiles, and the way they looked at each other stunned the crowd far more than any scripted Hollywood moment. I still remember the weight of the silence in that studio. It was the kind of silence you get when laughter dies too quickly, and everyone senses that something real is about to surface. The night had begun in pure noise and light. Cameras swung over the cheering audience, the band crashed into a bright, fast rhythm, and the city glittered through the giant window behind the desk. Fallon leaned forward in his chair, smiling on cue, but inside he felt that familiar tug of restlessness. Another monologue, another set of jokes, another safe interview where the deepest question was about a stunt or a meme. People at home would laugh, scroll, and forget. A small part of him was tired of being forgettable. Backstage, away from the stage smoke and the roaring crowd, Keanu Reeves and Alexandra sat side by side on a narrow black couch. The hallway smelled faintly of coffee and old wood, and a thin hum from the studio crept under the door. Alexandra watched Keanu's hands as he flexed them slowly, like he was shaking off a memory only he could see. Fame had taught them to armor their private life, to give the world just enough to smile at, never enough to wound. Yet tonight, something in his quiet eyes told her this show might scratch deeper than either of them planned. "You're doing the motorcycle story, right?" she asked softly, brushing an invisible wrinkle from his sleeve. "The one where you almost broke your jaw again." He smiled, that crooked, shy smile that seemed to apologize for existing. "They always like the crashes," he said. "Easier to laugh at bruises than at hearts." There was a truth in his own words that made him look away for a second. Alexandra knew every scar on him, the visible and the invisible ones, and she also knew that behind his calm voice lived a man who had loved and lost more than the tabloids could ever guess. She squeezed his hand, and he let his fingers curl around hers, grounding himself in that simple kindness. When the stage manager burst through the door with a headset and a rush of air, the spell broke. "We're ready for you," she said. "They're already going crazy out there." Keanu stood, rolled his shoulders like an athlete before a fight, and offered his hand to Alexandra as if they were walking into something much more sacred than a television show. The corridor to the stage felt longer than usual. Each step echoed off the walls, stretching time, pulling old memories of red carpets, flashing lights, and questions that had nothing to do with what truly mattered to him. The moment they stepped into the light, the crowd exploded. People leaped to their feet, phones shot into the air, and the band played a riff that sounded like pure celebration. Jimmy rose from behind his desk, clapping, grinning with real excitement this time. There was an ease about the way Keanu helped Alexandra into her chair, the way she laughed at something he whispered, the way their shoulders brushed and then stayed touching. It wasn't flashy or staged. It was simple, quiet intimacy glowing in the middle of a loud world. Jimmy caught that tiny detail, and something in his chest tightened. They started with the usual fun. A clip from an action scene rolled on the big screen, Keanu dodging cars, sliding across asphalt, pulling off a stunt that looked half insane and half beautiful. The audience gasped and laughed as Jimmy replayed the moment where he fell, tumbling hard and popping back up with that stubborn resilience he was famous for. They joked about bruises, about ice baths, about how many bones a body could crack and still sign another film contract. On the surface, it was pure entertainment, but Alexandra's eyes softened when the camera cut back to Keanu's real face, the one that didn't have explosions and soundtracks to hide behind. Jimmy saw that look between them. It wasn't just romance, it was recognition. Two people who had walked through different fires and somehow found the same quiet shore. He glanced down at his blue card of pre-approved questions, career highlights, funny memories, a light question about art, and for a moment the card looked like a cage. The show would be safe if he stayed inside it, if he kept everything glossy and shallow. But there was a part of him that was tired of surface. He thought about the people watching at home, sitting alone on couches, holding their own heartbreaks with no soundtrack and no applause. Without quite deciding, he slipped the card under his desk. The conversation shifted, almost imperceptibly. He asked about Alexandra's art, about what it meant to pour feelings into color and shape. She spoke gently about using pain as pigment, about turning silence into something visible. Keanu listened with a softness that the cameras could never fully capture, pride and humility blending in his expression. The crowd quieted, leaning in, sensing there was more here than show business sparkle. It was fun, yes, but under the fun something heavier was starting to breathe. Jimmy felt his heart pounding faster than it ever did during a comedy bit. This was the moment where every instinct told him to bounce back to a joke to keep it light, to protect the ratings. Instead, he let the silence stretch a second longer than usual. The band waited. The cameras hovered. He looked at Keanu, then at Alexandra, and saw not celebrities, but two human beings who had survived things he could only guess at and had chosen somehow to keep loving. "Can I ask you something that's not on the card?" he said, his voice a shade lower, more honest. The audience rustled, sensing they were about to witness something unscripted. Keanu's eyebrows lifted. Alexandra tilted her head, curious but wary. Years of interviews had taught them that the most dangerous sentence in the world often started just like that. Jimmy took a breath that felt too loud in his own ears. "For both of you," he said, looking from one to the other. "When was the last time you felt truly loved, not admired, not praised, loved, the kind of love that makes you braver than you were the day before?" The question landed in the room like a weight thrown into still water. Laughter stopped. The band fell completely silent. Alexandra's smile faded, replaced by a raw, unguarded expression that almost looked like fear. Keanu's hand, resting on his knee, went still, his fingers curling inwards as if they were remembering the shape of someone's hand that was no longer there. For a heartbeat, he didn't look like an action hero or a movie star. He looked like a man standing at the edge of a memory he wasn't sure he could step into without breaking. Alexandra glanced at him, eyes shining with something unspoken, her lips parting as if to answer, and then closing again. The studio lights felt harsher now, too bright on faces that suddenly had nowhere to hide. Cameras zoomed in, catching every flicker of emotion, every breath held halfway. In the crowd, someone coughed and then went silent, as if even that tiny sound was too much. Keanu slowly turned toward Jimmy, then toward the audience, then finally to Alexandra, his gaze locking with hers. For a long, fragile second, it seemed like he might get up and walk off the stage, back into the safety of practice stories and half-truths. Instead, he drew in a slow breath that trembled at the edges, his throat working around words that hadn't yet found their courage. And just as he opened his mouth to speak, the giant screen behind them flickered, a faint glitch shivering through the image of the city skyline, as if the whole room itself was bracing for whatever truth was about to break it wide open. The night the mountain caught fire. Keanu kept his eyes on the trembling skyline behind Jimmy's shoulder, as if the city itself might give him the words he needed. The glitch on the screen smoothed out, the towers sharpening back into focus, but inside him everything was still flickering. Years of interviews had trained him to dodge questions like this with a joke or a gentle deflection. Tonight, for reasons he couldn't quite name, he felt tired of dodging. "The last time I felt that kind of love," he began, his voice lower than the microphones were used to. He paused, swallowing as the audience held its breath with him. "It wasn't on a red carpet, it wasn't at a premiere, it was on a mountain, in the middle of the night, when we thought we might not make it down." Jimmy blinked, thrown by the sudden turn. Alexandra's fingers brushed his sleeve, just a whisper of contact, but it steadied him. She knew exactly which night he meant. She had never expected him to speak about it on television, but something in his posture told her he needed to. They had traveled to a remote location a year earlier, far from the city lights, where the sky felt close enough to touch, and the air smelled like pine and old stone. Officially, it was for a film shoot, and an art retreat rolled into one. Unofficially, it was an escape. A place where he could ride his motorcycle without cameras following, where she could paint until dawn without her name trending for the wrong reasons. They had both been running in different ways, from grief, from pressure, from the heavy hands of expectation, until they realized the only way to really rest was to run in the same direction. "We were on this ridge," Keanu said slowly, his eyes fixed on a point far beyond the studio lights. The crew had wrapped for the day. It was quiet. No engines, no explosions, no stunts, just wind and stars and this crazy sense that the world was wider than any movie could show. I remember thinking, this is it. This is what peace feels like. Alexandra watched him, her own heart replaying the moment. She remembered how he had stood on the edge of the cliff, silhouette cut against a sky full of burning orange and deep violet, like one of her own paintings come to life. He had looked small and infinite at the same time. She'd almost taken a photo, but something stopped her. Some instinct that this memory needed to live unfiltered just between them. And then, he said, a rough, almost disbelieving laugh catching in his throat, "We smelled smoke." The audience shifted, murmuring softly. Jimmy leaned in, the comedian in him quiet for once, replaced by the boy who had grown up watching heroes in dark movie theaters, never expecting to sit inches away from one telling a story that sounded less like a script and more like a confession. "At first we thought it was just a campfire," Alexandra added, her voice clear but threaded with an old echo of fear. "We joked about someone roasting marshmallows down the slope, but the wind changed, and the sky turned this sick, angry color, not like sunset, like something was burning that shouldn't be burning." Keanu nodded. He could still taste the bitterness of that smoke on the back of his tongue. One of the assistant directors had run up the path, face pale under the dust, walkie-talkie crackling uselessly in his hand. There was shouting then, scattered and frantic, about a fire line jumping the road, about dry brush going up like paper. Their escape route, one narrow road curling down the mountain, was already threatened. "Up there," Keanu said slowly, "you realize how small you really are. How fast everything you think you control can disappear. There are no stunt coordinators for real fire. No reset button if you get it wrong." His jaw worked, remembering the way crew members had started grabbing equipment, instinctively trying to save cameras, lights, the expensive toys that defined their working lives. His first reflex had been the same. Save the production, keep the machines safe. It was almost automatic, the reflex of decades in the industry. Then he'd seen one of the youngest grips, a kid barely out of film school, standing frozen beside a stack of cases, eyes huge, shaking so hard he could barely hold onto the handle of the nearest one. "That's when she grabbed my arm," Keanu said, nodding toward Alexandra. "And she said something that kind of broke me in the best way." Alexandra remembered the exact feel of his leather jacket under her fingers, the faint smell of gasoline and cold air. She had seen the calculation in his face, the way he was already prioritizing gear, shots, schedules. She also saw the terrified kid beside him, invisible in the panic. "I told him," she said quietly, "leave the cameras, take the people." Words hung in the studio like fresh smoke. On the night of the fire, they had sliced through the chaos, simple and brutal. Keanu had looked at her for half a beat, really looked, and something had shifted. Not in his body, he was already strong, already practiced in danger, but in his focus. Fame had taught him that he was valuable because of what he could produce, what he could perform. In that one command, she stripped all of that away and gave him a different mission. Not star, not lead, not asset. Just human, just one human trying to save other humans. "I don't know what flipped in my head," he told Jimmy now. "But in that second, the movie didn't matter. The stunts didn't matter. The box office didn't matter. All that mattered was getting everyone down that mountain alive." His fingers tightened together, knuckles blanching for a moment with remembered urgency. The audience was stone still. Even the crew around the cameras had stopped their subtle movements, sucked into the story like everyone else. "And that's when the wind hit," Keanu continued, his voice dropping. "It roared up the canyon and we saw the fire coming around the ridge, fast, faster than anything I've ever tried to outrun in a scene." He turned toward Alexandra, eyes dark with the weight of what he was about to say next. The memory was sharp now, close enough to cut. "We had one road down," he said. "One narrow, twisting road, half blocked with gear trucks and trailers, and as the flames started moving toward us, we realized something terrible." He paused, his Adam's apple bobbing. "If we didn't clear that road in minutes," he whispered, "some of us would have to choose who got to leave and who didn't." The audience let out a collective breath that sounded almost like a gasp, a low wave of dread rolling through the room. Jimmy's hand, resting on his desk, curled into a fist so tight his knuckles ached. The band, forgotten in the shadows, exchanged looks, the reality of the story sinking deeper than any scripted drama. Alexandra's eyes glistened with the ghost of that moment. On the mountain, the fire had painted the world in violent orange. Here, under cool studio lights, the memory burned even hotter. She opened her mouth, feeling the old heat rush back into her chest. "What happened next?" she said, voice shaking despite her control, "was the moment I understood what kind of man I was really in love with." And with that, the studio fell into deeper silence, every soul waiting for the next sentence like it might rewrite their understanding of courage and of love itself. The fire line. Flames moved with a mind of their own. That was the first thing Keanu remembered once the shouting started to blur. They didn't rise politely from the trees like in controlled scenes on a film set. They lunged and curled, breathing, choosing, searching. One spark leaped from a pine crown to a dry hillside, and suddenly the mountain itself seemed alive and angry. Trucks blocked the only road down, massive shadows against the choking orange light. Cables and cases lay tangled like abandoned skeletons of the day's work. The air grew thick and sharp, each breath a scratch in the throat. Someone yelled for everyone to move toward the vehicles. Someone else screamed not to run, which of course meant people started to run. "I've done so many action scenes," Keanu said, his voice narrating the memory as if he was watching a film he still didn't quite understand. "You think you're prepared for chaos because you've practiced pretending, but in that moment I realized how much of my life had been rehearsed. This was." He had wanted to freeze for half a second to grab a plan from somewhere, but there was no time. So he did the one thing he trusted. He looked for the people who were the most afraid. Their faces stood out, white and rigid, bodies small and stiff against the fury of the wind. Alexandra saw the same thing. Years of working with quiet souls, young artists, shy students, people who hid their brilliance, had trained her eyes to find the ones who were about to disappear into the background exactly when they most needed to be seen. "Hey," she shouted over the roar, her voice cutting sharper than she expected. "If you're not driving, find someone who is, two to a truck at least. No one leaves alone. No one stays alone." There was authority in her tone that surprised some of the crew. She wasn't on the call sheet as a producer or coordinator. She was artist, guest, partner, a footnote to the main event. But in the storm of fire, titles lost their power. Clarity did not. Keanu ran toward the mess of trucks, waving his arms, using that familiar voice the whole world knew, to shout something new. "Forget the gear," he yelled. "Leave it, people first, clear the road." The stunt team, already trained for emergencies, snapped to his call quicker than the rest. They dropped heavy cases, rolled them into ditches, kicked away light stands that could punch through windshields. Someone stared helplessly at a $100,000 camera perched on the edge of a tailgate. "Let it go," Keanu told him, meeting the man's panicked eyes. "We can replace it, we can't replace you." In the studio, the audience barely breathed. On the mountain, breaths had come in gasps and coughs. The flames were close enough now to spit sparks onto their jackets. A low, animal roar filled the canyon, vibrating the ground under their boots. One of the assistant directors stumbled, twisting his ankle in a rut, and went down with a ragged cry. People surged past him, eyes locked on the narrow gap between the last truck and the start of the burning brush. Alexandra saw him fall and veer toward him without thinking, skidding on loose gravel as she dropped to her knees. "Can you stand?" she shouted, grabbing his arm. His face was gray, not just from the smoke, but from terror. His ankle looked wrong, already swelling. The fire line crept closer, a river of heat they could feel on their backs. Keanu saw them and sprinted over, his lungs burning as hot as the air. He hooked one arm under the AD's shoulder, the other around Alexandra's waist, and hauled both of them up with a grunt. Pain shot down his own leg where an old injury complained, but there was no room for complaint now. "Truck 3, Alexandra yelled, spotting a pickup with empty space in the cab. "Make room!" The driver looked torn between the blocked road and the figures running toward him. One of the stunt coordinators banged on the hood. "They're coming with you," he ordered. "Move." They shoved the injured director into the back seat, Alexandra climbing in beside him as Keanu shoved his own panic down, backpedaling away to help open the path for the others. She leaned out the window, fingers catching his sleeve for one last moment before the truck lurched forward. "You're not a martyr," she shouted, face fierce under the swirling ash. "Don't you dare forget to save yourself too." The words rang in his skull as he turned back to the chaos. Save yourself too. They sounded selfish and holy at the same time. All his life, it had been easier to get hurt than to watch someone else get hurt instead. On screen, that made him a hero. In real life, it could make him a ghost. Tonight, on that mountain, he had to learn the harder balance, courage that included his own survival. A smaller van at the back of the line sputtered, engine coughing. Inside, 3 crew members argued, each insisting the others go ahead. One of them, a young woman from the lighting team, clutched a canvas case to her chest like a shield. "What is that?" Keanu demanded, appearing at her window. She looked embarrassed, smoke-streaked cheeks flushing. "It's the lenses," she admitted. "If we lose these, production's screwed." Her voice cracked on the word screwed, revealing what she really meant. "If I'm the one who let them burn, I'm screwed." Keanu didn't answer at once. Instead, he reached in and placed his hand gently on the case. "What's your name?" he asked over the roar. "Marisol," she said, coughing. "Marisol," he replied. "No one will even remember these lenses if something happens to you. Drop them on the floor and get that van moving. That's an order from the guy whose face is on the poster." A strained laugh escaped her, a bubble of relief breaking through panic. She let the case fall, hands suddenly free to grip the wheel. The van lurched forward inch by inch as Keanu and a stunt rigger threw their weight against one of the heavier trucks, rocking it just enough to open a slim, terrifying path between metal and flame. In the studio, the crowd could see it. The man they knew for choreography and cool one-liners now drenched in real sweat and fear, pushing steel with bare hands, shouting hoarse encouragement, refusing to be first or last in line. Courage didn't look glamorous in his telling. It looked like dirty lungs, shaking legs, and 100 small, stubborn choices. "At some point," he said quietly, "I found myself at the back. There was one last truck that wouldn't start, old thing, stalled out. A teamster was under the hood, swearing so creatively I almost applauded." The audience chuckled through their tension, grateful for the tiny release. We could already feel the heat on our faces. The sky was glowing. It felt like we were inside a furnace. Alexandra's hands, folded in her lap on the couch, tightened now. She remembered that exact second from a different angle, the view from inside the moving truck, looking back through the smoky windshield, watching the shape of the mountain bend with fire. She had counted vehicles like a mantra, 1, 2, 3, 4, and realized with a jolt that one was missing. His. "What happened?" Jimmy asked softly, leaning so far forward his tie brushed the desk. Keanu's gaze slid to Alexandra, then back to the crowd. "What happened," he said, "is that I realized I had a choice. I could keep fighting that dead engine and maybe die trying to be the last good guy on the hill, or I could listen to the woman who told me to save myself too." He let that sink in. Even now, the decision sat strangely in his chest. He had built an entire image on being the man who never walked away from the burning building. But up there, he had learned that sometimes survival was the bravest thing you could choose. "So I ran," he said simply. Somewhere in the back row, a viewer gasped aloud, surprised by the stark honesty. He didn't dress the moment up. He didn't call it a tactical retreat or a cinema-worthy sprint. He just told the truth. He ran. "I left the truck," he continued. "I yelled at the teamster to get out and come with me. We went on foot, through smoke so thick we could barely see the ground. I could hear engines below, honking, people shouting each other's names. I didn't know if we'd find any of them again." Alexandra's throat tightened. In the moving truck, she had watched her own reflection in the side mirror shimmer with fire. Each curve of the road revealed a new section of burning hillside and still no sign of him. She had pressed her hand to the glass, silently bargaining with whatever forces governed chance. Take the film, take the cameras, take the mountain if you have to. Just don't take him. On the show, her voice broke its own silence. "I was in the last truck that made it to the lower turn," she said. "I kept looking in the mirrors for him, for that stupid leather jacket." The crowd laughed softly, then hushed, sensing tears just behind the humor. "When we reached the bend, the driver said we had to keep going or the road would close. I told him if he didn't stop for 30 seconds, I was getting out and walking back up alone." Jimmy's eyes widened. "You were going to walk toward the fire." She shrugged, a small, helpless motion. "You don't measure risk the same way when the person you love is up there. All I knew was, If he was going to be stupidly brave, I could at least be stupidly loyal. The 30 seconds felt like an hour that night. The truck idled at the bend, engine rattling, everyone inside shouting different versions of the same plea. Go, stay, don't, please. The driver's hands shook on the wheel. Smoke swirled around them, hiding and revealing shapes like a nightmare. And then, Alexandra said, a faint, stunned smile ghosting across her lips, we saw two figures appear out of the smoke, running. One of them was waving his arms like a maniac. Keanu's shoulders relaxed at the memory. The Teamster, he admitted. He told me he wasn't ready to become barbecue. We stumbled down that last stretch together, barely able to see. And then the road kind of appeared out of nowhere. Trucks, people. And this one woman leaning out of a window, yelling my name at the top of her lungs, ready to throw herself into the flames because she refused to leave alone. The crowd's soft laughter mingled with an ache that sat just beneath their ribs. Alexandra lowered her eyes, suddenly shy. That's when I felt it, Keanu said quietly, his voice almost a whisper now. That kind of love you asked about, Jimmy, not because she was willing to die with me, but because she was willing to fight me, to drag me back to life, to be angry at me if I treated my own life like something disposable. He spread his hands, palms open, a man with nothing left to hide in that story. That night, going down that mountain in a truck full of coughing, shaking crew, with this paint-splattered woman scolding me for almost getting myself killed. That's the last time I remember feeling completely, absolutely loved. The studio sat in stillness thick enough to touch. Some audience members blinked hard, surprised tears stinging their eyes. Jimmy's throat worked as he searched for words, his usual arsenal of quips useless against the rawness in front of him. He finally managed, and after that, after you got everyone down. Keanu inhaled, the breath steady but deep. After that, he said, I thought the lesson was over. I thought we just survived something and we would go back to work like people always do. But I was wrong. He glanced at Alexandra, whose gaze had turned distant again, somewhere back on that mountain. Because the real test, he added softly, wasn't surviving the fire. It was what we did with our lives the morning after. The implication hung in the air like the last ember of a dying flame, too bright to ignore, too fragile to touch. The morning after. Smoke still clung to their hair the next day, even after long showers and the hotel's thin soap. It had soaked into their clothes, their skin, their dreams. Every closed eyelid replayed images of orange sky and running figures, of missed steps and near misses. The hotel cafe, usually full of crew laughter and music, sounded like a library. Cups clinked too loudly against saucers. People whispered instead of joked. The studio called, of course, Keanu said, a wry note slipping into his voice as he told the story to Jimmy and the millions watching from home. Insurance, schedules, they wanted to know how much equipment we'd lost, how fast we could get back up the mountain once the fire was contained. He had stared at his phone, listening to the list of financial concerns, feeling a growing disconnect between the words in his ear and the reality in his chest. We almost died, he thought, and the first language we go back to is money. It wasn't that the questions were evil. They were just small compared to the size of what they had faced. Across the cafe, Alexandra watched a young production assistant stir his coffee without sipping it, his hand trembling just enough to rattle the spoon. Marisol from lighting, still smelling faintly of melted rubber, sat alone at a table, eyes swollen from a night without sleep. The injured assistant director limped to the counter, wincing with each step, his ankle wrapped in a stiff plastic brace. Their faces carried more than exhaustion. They carried a new knowledge. How thin the wall was between an ordinary workday and the end of everything. I kept thinking, Alexandra told the audience, if we pretend this was just a scary incident and hurry back to normal, we're wasting something important. Like we've been handed a message and we're too busy to read it. Jimmy nodded slowly. What message? He asked. She glanced at Keanu, their private language flashing for a second in the look they shared. That we don't control how long we get, she said, but we do control what we do with the part of the story that's still left. In the cafe, that message had arrived in quieter form. Keanu hung up with the studio and sat for a long time, staring out the window at the hazy shape of the scarred mountain. Blackened skeletons of trees lined the slope like guardians who'd failed their watch. He thought of other losses, old ones, deep ones, that had carved similar scars inside him. Grief had become a familiar roommate in his life, silent and stubborn. For years, he had lived like a man waiting for the next fire, keeping people at arm's length, afraid that anyone who got too close would end up as ashes. Yet last night, someone had run toward the danger for him. "What are you thinking?" Alexandra asked, sliding into the chair opposite him. Her coffee sat untouched, steam fading into the heavy air. He took a moment to answer, because honesty still felt like a new language he was learning to speak with her. "I'm thinking how many times I've almost walked away," he admitted. "From acting, from all of this." He gestured vaguely, meaning not just the industry but life under its strange, relentless spotlight. "I tell myself I'm protecting people by staying small, by keeping my distance." She listened without interrupting, her eyes steady, no judgment in them. Kindness on her never looked like softness. It looked like strength choosing not to crush. "And," she prodded gently. "And last night," he continued, "I realized that distance doesn't stop the fire. It just means you're alone when it comes. Maybe the point isn't to avoid getting burned. Maybe the point is to decide who you're holding onto when the sky turns orange." The cafe sounds blurred around them for a moment. For all their years of friendship and the love that had slowly grown from it, there were still layers they were only now peeling back. Alexandra felt a lump rise in her throat. She had fallen for him in quiet, ordinary hours, shared books, late-night food, long motorcycle rides where they barely spoke. But it was the sight of him on that burning road, refusing to abandon strangers, that had turned affection into something fiercer. "I was angry with you," she confessed, surprising herself. "In the truck, I was furious you might die trying to be noble. I kept thinking, he's not mine to give away like that. He doesn't get to throw himself into the fire without asking the people who love him if we're okay losing him." He blinked, startled by the rawness of her words. No one had ever framed his recklessness that way before. Heroes in stories belonged to everyone and to no one. But in real life, people were claimed by friends, by family, by the quiet, stubborn love of those who waited for them to come home. "So," she continued, voice shaking, "if you're asking what we do with the morning after, I think we stop living like loaned-out ghosts. We stop pretending our lives don't matter because other people have it worse. We start admitting that we're scared and that we still choose to stay, together, on purpose." In the studio, a few audience members wiped at their eyes, caught off guard by how closely this conversation brushed against their own secret fears. How many of them had been moving through life like they were temporary guests, not fully committing to relationships, dreams, or even their own survival. Jimmy swallowed hard, thinking about hospital rooms and late-night anxiety and the strange emptiness that sometimes followed a night of making millions of people laugh. He recognized the ghost feeling she described. He had worn it like an invisible coat more nights than he could count. "Did you say that to him?" he asked, "back then?" Alexandra smiled ruefully. "Not exactly like that," she admitted. "What I actually said was, if you ever treat your life like it's disposable again, I'm going to paint your motorcycle bright pink so you remember you're not some tragic action figure." Laughter burst across the studio, grateful and loud. Even Keanu doubled over, the tension breaking for a sweet second. "She means it too," he said, grinning through the remnants of emotion. "She already bought the paint." Behind the cameras, producers exchanged looks. The segment had drifted far from the approved questions, deep into the dangerous territory of vulnerability and philosophy. A red light blinked near Jimmy's desk, the warning that they were overdue for a commercial break. In his ear, the control room voice sharpened. "We have to cut to ads," the director insisted. "You're over time, wrap this up, bring them back with something light." Jimmy stared at the little blinking light as if it were another kind of alarm, less dramatic than a wildfire but somehow just as urgent in its own way. He knew the machine they all worked inside. Seconds scheduled, emotions trimmed to fit between brand messages. It kept their jobs alive. It kept the whole circus spinning. But looking at Keanu and Alexandra now, he felt a surge of quiet rebellion. He thought of the viewers at home, The lonely, the grieving, the ones who had almost given up last week or last year and were still here anyway. What if this was the part of the show they needed most? Not the perfectly timed joke, not the polished anecdote, but this. 3 people on a couch, all of them admitting they were a little bit broken and still choosing to care. In his ear, the voice pressed harder. Jimmy, now throw to commercial. His hand rose automatically to touch his earpiece. Then slowly, he pulled it out and set it on the desk. The crew froze, the band members exchanged shocked glances. No one went off script like that, not on a show this big, not live. Jimmy looked at Keanu and Alexandra, then straight into camera 1, eyes clear, pulse thundering. "I know we're supposed to go to a break," he said, speaking not just to the room but to the network, the advertisers, all the invisible systems that decided what stories were worth time. "But I think we need to stay here for a minute." He turned back to his guests, his voice softening. "Because I have a feeling you didn't just survive that fire. I think you made a decision after it, about how you wanted to live from then on." Keanu exhaled slowly, something like relief flickering across his face. Alexandra's shoulders relaxed, the tension giving way to a new kind of resolve. "You're right," she said quietly. Jimmy leaned in, breaking every timing rule he'd ever learned. "So what did you decide?" he asked, the question landing with the weight of a challenge and an invitation both. The studio held its breath again, the show now clearly somewhere beyond ordinary entertainment, perched on the edge of something braver, and no one knew yet whether it would crash or fly.